Hello and welcome to another episode of the Revenue Revolution podcast brought to you by Jointflows. Today we're joined by James Pursey, who is the co-founder and CEO of Replicate Labs. How are you?
I'm very well. It's great to be here. Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Thank you for joining us. We always like to kick things off with a little bit of an introduction, so our listeners can get up to speed on who you are. So who is James? How have you got to where you've got to?
Aside from being the founder of Replicate, which feels like it kind of defines me these days, um, I have a background in marketing first. So I did marketing for about 5, 6 years, and then I went into the wonderful world of sales. And my most recent job before I founded the business was I was a VP of enablement and customer success at a public
Mm.
company called SimilarWeb. It's very polarizing to go from 150 people to me and my co-founder. But yeah, so we've built what we're doing now is to solve very specific problems that I saw in both of those worlds, right? The marketing and the sales space. Um, yeah, I don't know if that defines me, which was closer to your question, but professionally, that's me.
Yeah, amazing. And I know, I guess the way this came about, we touched on it briefly before we hit the record button, was you had conducted a survey, which had some great response in terms of the rate, but then some amazing insights as well. A lot of it was based around, I guess, the enablement space in terms of how is it that we can help people get better at their jobs. But not everyone was thinking the same way, I guess. And there was a few statistics or a few insights that you got from that, which were quite damning, I believe. So why don't you talk a little bit about that and how the idea of the survey came around, and then, what were the kind of key learnings that you've taken away from that?
Yeah, for sure. So um, when I was running enablement, I thought for an embarrassingly long time that the problems that we had were specific to the company I worked at, right? We thought it was some kind of cultural issue in people's willingness to learn and adopt new things. And would just try in-house loads of different things to try and solve that. And then when I discovered the world outside of my employer and realized that that was just a problem everywhere, the thing I'd experienced was also a problem everywhere, right? Like so many people think that they're in this bubble of uniqueness, and they're just not, and that can be quite lonely when the majority of stuff that you're doing isn't getting adopted, isn't getting worked. Your enablement functions are getting fired because they can't prove ROI and all that kind of stuff. So the main kind of motivation behind the survey was to we couldn't find anything like this out there, and we wanted some sort, even though it's a survey, right? It's not like quantitative. We
Mm,
wanted some form of source of truth for people to kind of prove that these problems are universal and that people aren't alone, and that there's some functional reasons behind it that aren't culture, which feels like a bit of a dodge, right? When things aren't
mm,
working, you just blame this fluffy thing that no one defines well. Um, so yeah, we wanted it to be fair. So what we did with the survey was we actually surveyed all of the different stakeholders in that world. So we had enablement people, we had quite a lot of individual contributors, mainly sales reps, we had line managers, and then senior leaders, and we segmented and gave them all different questions. Some of them were the same so that we could tell the differences, but they all went on these different tracks. And that allowed us to really kind of zero in on, you know, how universal the problem of sales training, to be blunt, being a waste of everybody's time is, right?
mhm.
Um, and then also trying to understand kind of why and what some of the underlying problems are. And we had a little bit of, I don't know if fun's the right word, but we teed up some comparison questions expecting to get quite radical responses, and we were surprised by just how extreme some of the differences were. And yeah, that's what it's all about. So it was done by about 250 people. They collectively answered over 6,000 questions, so it's a huge amount of information. And even all the free text questions were rolled back up right into trends and topics and stuff. So yeah, that's what it was. It's been downloaded by about 1,000 people. Anyone that
Nice.
wants it can grab it on our website. Um, and yeah, the stats are just horrifying, but not surprising is probably the best way of phrasing it.
Yeah.
I read the survey as soon as it came out, and I must admit that that's probably one of the best surveys, eye-opening surveys I've read in a long time, including the last Forrester report I've read this morning. Um, and I mean the main stat there, which is crazy scary, is that people think that the performance would actually go up if they stopped enablement altogether. Is that a fair
Yeah,
statement?
yeah, and it's not just enablement, it's like any form of guidance, right? So
Mm.
the question was, what do you think would happen to rep quota attainment if you shut down? And the list was training, feedback, coaching, role plays, um, basically everything, right? So including the stuff that managers do, including the peer-to-peer stuff. If you shut all of it down, what would happen? And then we segmented that into those groups, and yeah, it was managers and senior leaders both gave very similar answers, and it was basically 1 in 4 of them thinks that performance would actually go up, which yeah is a incredibly damning
Yeah.
to the current experience that people have in those various areas. Um, but one of the things that I think we call out is like enablement report to the SLT. So the very people who are designing and defining what enablement should focus on don't
Mm.
believe it's going to work, which is I mean
It's
I'm
crazy.
smiling and laughing about it because if you don't, you're going to cry. um but yeah, it's really quite alarming, and like even if you ignore the efficacy, like the general notion that people's performance will go up if nobody tries to help them
Yeah.
is, when you frame it that way, quite scary, really.
And so where's the I mean there's probably like 10,000 reasons, but what's the core reason for such big disconnect from what you see?
I think that like there's a couple of kind of key areas. One that we hammer a lot throughout the report is that nobody agrees on anything. And I don't mean the
Mm.
outcomes, I don't mean the results. I mean like even the definitions. Like there's a question that we asked reps and we asked line managers how often they provide coaching.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
a really high percentage of reps, I can't remember exactly what the number is. Let me pull it up because it's another one of those. Um, so yeah, coaching. 27% of reps say that they never get coaching from their managers at all. And conversely, 0% of managers say the same thing. Now, that might not sound super surprising, but actually our interpretation of it, because obviously we've got all the comments that go behind it, right? We've got
Mm.
all the context of the other questions, was we don't think either side is lying. We think they have a different definition of what coaching is. Um,
Mm.
and like coaching is not watching a callback and suggesting 1 or 2 things they could have done differently. That's feedback, different thing.
Yeah.
So and like we see it throughout. The report is structured into like the planning exercise of what do we actually focus on and why, the execution, right? So training, practice, feedback, role play, whatever, and then the way that we measure it. And in all 3 of those segments, you get this extreme polarization between how enablement view things, how reps view things, and how management view things. And if we're not on the same page about what we're even doing, like it's never
Yeah.
going to work as effectively as it could. So I think that's kind of that like organizational alignment, all the internal stuff is major. We suggest some kind of like charter. Like I think very, I'm British, but I think very like American, right? Like we need some
Yeah.
kind of constitution rules that everybody in the company physically signs when they join or something that just gives common definitions to these things. And it sounds ridiculous, but everyone needs to be on the same page.
Yeah.
Um, and then the other side to it, which is where we think technology can help and where our business comes in, is um, there's just a distinct lack of context, right? Like people don't learn by sitting and watching a webinar.
Yeah.
They also typically don't learn from doing an e-learning course unless that e-learning course is structured in a phenomenal way, which it can be, but commonly isn't. And most of the knowledge that you teach people is about your own business, your own products, your own functionality, your own solution. And the stuff that's about the buyers is often like institutionally made up, right? Like someone in marketing has said, we sell to VP sales and this is what they care about.
Yeah.
And again, not to kind of be negative on them, they're doing their job, but it is making a lot of guesses and assumptions. And then on the flip side, the way you actually sell to someone is simply knowing who they are, right? Like if I'm selling to you, Mick, right, and I understand who you are, what you do, and what you care about right now today, if I actually have something that can help you, we'll get there. We'll find that point. But we do pretty much no training on the buyer side that's based in reality. And then on top of that, the way that we're training is in that disconnected reality, right? Like passively sitting and watching something. So those are the two sides to it that we find is the business has zero alignment of what they're doing. And then even if they did, everything needs to be in the context of the only thing that actually matters, which is the buyer. And context is important, right? And when you're being taught something, it needs to feel like the real thing. Otherwise, you create this big like mental barrier that you have to cross to use it in real life. So that's way more nuanced. But those are the two kind of themes that come out of it.
Yeah. What was surprising to me, having had a look at the report, is how contrasting the view of ICs are versus leadership management. Not just in terms of like how much training do you think they get, but going back to the original point, which was that it looks like ICs are screaming for training and for enablement. Yet 25% of senior leadership think if you don't provide them with any training or any kind of enablement, their performance will improve. Right, very, very contrasting views over here at different levels of the organization. What do you think is causing that?
Yeah, I think another thing, by the way, that we found, one area we did actually find quite surprising is when reps add context to their answers through the free text questions, they tend to give really logical, well thought out, considered responses. When we ask managers what, so like if you ask reps why sales training doesn't stick, for example, you get really practical responses. When we ask managers and actually senior leaders in particular, they just blame reps, right? Like it's really extreme. It's like the for example, I'll give you a couple of call outs from it.
Yeah.
Can you
85%.
Can you throw in some names as well? Which is like
I mean, but we laugh, but that's the most staggering thing about this is like we didn't make this up. This is literally these people like filled this thing in, right? So I'll give you a kind of execution and then more of the emotive response. So from an execution perspective, a key reason that I think this gap exists, right, is enablement. How often do you use webinars and e-learnings in your training? 85%, right? Reps. What is the most effective way that you get trained? Workshops, role plays. What is the least effective way that you get trained? Webinars, e-learning.
Yeah, I saw that.
Right. So like just this is what I mean by alignment, right? Like enablement might be creating the world's greatest training sessions and the world's greatest e-learnings, but if the reps aren't going to go into it wanting to learn, and if they don't find it that useful, then they're not going to learn. And then on the blaming front, because this is all particularly kind of pretty brutal, is 44% of leaders directly blame reps for the state of sales training, right? So when we ask why things don't work, 44% of respondents made a unproven statement about reps' willingness to learn, reps' attitude about learning, like that kind of stuff, right? And it wasn't practical. It wasn't, they don't turn up to the training. Like it was very much on like willingness and competency. And then there was a big one. This report, by the way, for listeners' context, is 20 pages long. And we made it a little while ago. So I'm sifting through it. But leaders are 2.5 times more likely than any other group to believe that adoption stems from a problem of reps not wanting to learn. Right? Like that's quite a strong statement. And reps did self-classify that in a few ways, right? Like 8% of reps said, I just don't want to do this thing that you're telling me to do. So it wasn't like they weren't, like everyone was kind of lying about it. But yeah, the difference even between managers and leaders, right, which in a lot of the report align, leaders 3 times more likely than managers to blame the problem on rep willingness, right? So I think that's a key part of it, is like, if we're not, and if we relate it back to the alignment, if we don't have the same definition of things and this mutual alignment of what we're doing, right? And if we're not measuring what we're doing, which is a really big thing, right, in this space, then the only thing left is personal opinion. And if you're defining things differently, then your opinion as to why they don't work will be very different. And then kind of the outshot of it is this, like you see with those statistics, like it kind of breeds like negativity, which is the ultimate killer to any like successful program, whatever that is, whether it's training or something else. So yeah, like the enabler the enablement hat on says it's leadership's fault, right? But then kind of the leader hat on would say, and we did a podcast about this a couple of weeks ago with someone else, like maybe it's actually the enablement leader's ability to manage up and manage down at the same time, right? Because ultimately they're the biggest cog in that machine. Yeah. So the root cause is there, but like just like the alignment thing, whose responsibility actually is it to fix this? I would say everybody, but that's not how reality works, right? So it's not a simple like flick a switch, and this problem's existed for, I know I've been rambling for a long time, but the base behavioral mechanism that exists here is called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And that concept is 136 years old, right? So this isn't a simple, like, that's the problem, flip the switch, we're good, right? Like, it's way more complicated than that, but it's definitely a big issue. And if it doesn't work, by the way, we always think about it in terms of obviously harming the buyer experience, harming quota performance and whatever, but it's also an enormous waste of everybody's time. Which is a big thing.
And money, because I feel like the standard go back in terms of technology is always you take an L&D platform, which I like, learning and development platform, and I think it's the wrong way to do enablement for the reasons you mentioned, James. And if I add to that list as well, is I think everything is also front loaded. You go through the vast majority of your training within the first 3 weeks in the company, and then it's kind of every now and then you get an update, mostly on product. Like, this is what the new product features are, and actually nothing about the buyer. The content is made by people who've never sold or even spoken to a prospect at all. And the fallback is either you do that or you bring in a conversational intelligence solutions. And there's a stat in your report that says that 51% of reps say is somewhat useful, and 12% of reps said that it's actually a waste of time to have this solution. So all of them together, they are not quite convinced about the value of CI at all. Like, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think it circles back to that problem statement. Like the overwhelming thing that the report says is that what we're doing today doesn't work. And I think that has to extend in every direction, right? So you've got your organizational alignment, you've got the ability to manage up and down and like centralize the process, but then you've also got to admit that the technology that you're using to close this gap is failing you, right? Like, I think I have a lot of thoughts on this topic. I think that when you buy software to do a job in the same way that you hire somebody to do a job, right? Yeah. But this bizarre thing that happens is the second you buy it, you stop thinking about the job that you bought it to do, and you start to just obsess over people using it. And I think that this is what I see a lot with conversational intelligence. And I saw it having bought more than one of the kind of flagship brands in the space when I was at SimilarWeb, is you buy it, or at least for us, the job to be done, right, was facilitating more coaching, right? And the product usage was super high, but what it actually was reps listening back to their calls. Or if a manager did use it for something like coaching, they weren't using the scorecards, or if they were, they weren't using it objectively, or they weren't doing it at a, like, the point in time that you review a call relative to when the call happened is important, because just like training itself, you forget, right? And then you forget before you get an opportunity to put it into action. So like all of the metrics that you would say in the purchase process, right? Everyone's a medic fan at the moment, right? Were the reasons and the way that you would assess the successful rollout of conversational intelligence or any software products. We see that they kind of get thrown out the window immediately, and just this obsession with adoption becomes a factor. And then what happens is you're at renewal 12 months later, you haven't improved your sales training, you haven't improved your coaching, you haven't improved your reps performance, right?
Yeah.
But the vendor goes, you guys really love this product, don't you? And you go, yeah, we do. Here's an extra 10% for an annual price increase. And like, you'd never do that with the rep. Like, you could hire a rep that you love, that's a phenomenal cultural fit that everybody gets on with, right? But if they don't perform, eventually they're going to get cut. And it's bizarre that we don't see that with software. So I think that there's an enormous place for it.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in that kind of general category and area. I use my own, not that we've made it. I use a kind of up and coming CI tool myself. But I think the way that people use them is wrong, because the alignment is bad, right? And for sure, I think the root cause of it is that we don't hold the vendor accountable to what we're actually trying to achieve, in the same way that we would hold a member of staff accountable. So I probably went off at a bit of a tangent, but this is a topic I feel very passionately about, because I think so many go-to-market orgs waste millions on shelfware, and they don't know why.
So does part of that blame, well, I don't know if blame is the right word, but does part of it fall under the responsibility of the enablement function as well then? Right, which was certainly back to like a question I had in my mind, and it's kind of linked to this as well, is when you come up with an initiative from an enablement or company perspective to say, right, we need to improve X, Y, and Z across our sales reps. Who is the onus on within the organization to determine what it is you're trying to fix here? And then two, determines, all right, how are we going to go about fixing this? And then the final one is, how are we actually going to measure the impact that this has had?
Yeah. This is kind of the kind of trifecta of problems with this whole sector, right? Is and we have a whole like section on this in that report as well. So planning, I'm trying to think of how to frame the answer in my mind. So planning should be a function of business need, which should probably align with buyer need, right? So what I mean by that is, if the business problem is qualified pipeline isn't converting at the required level through to a proposal stage, right? The only possible reason for that, if it is qualified, right, which is what the statement says, the only possible reason is that we're not demonstrating value enough, right? So the business problem is we don't demonstrate value enough in the first third of the cycle. The buyer problem is that's because you're not speaking my language, understanding what I'm doing, understanding my pains, asking me the right questions, right? And that's quantifiable and behavioral, which is like a perfect kind of sweet spot. So what should happen is that we identify that programmatically, not from anyone's opinion, right? But like, this is the biggest point of failure in our business right now, right? Then enablement, and this is just my opinion, right? But enablement then get tasked with how you would solve that. So let's imagine that you don't have a value sales methodology, right? Which 80% of reps surveyed said they don't, which is quite shocking to me. Let's say enablement decide we need to go and invest in one of these big methodologies, right? A Sandler or a Force, a value selling associates, that kind of thing, right? They're the learning experts, right? So they should be the ones that are designing the program, facilitating what goes into it, and designing the aftercare, right? But they're not the manager. So they teach you how to do this thing, hopefully in context. And then the point that the big point of failure in adopting any form of training is the what happens next, right? Which is giving enough feedback, giving enough coaching, doing enough practice. Like practice is a big one, right? 67% of reps said that they don't do any role play ever. Like, have you ever learned anything in your life by not practicing it ever? Right? I mean, I knew one kid at school that was good at anything, right? They could touch a football for the first time and they were the next Messi, right? But one person.
Yeah.
But like practice is how we learn, yet it's not a thing that happens. So enablement, in my opinion, should design that, and then the management function are part of enablement, even if they're not willing to believe it, are responsible for kind of coaching everything into life. And then it has to back into, to your point, to specific measurable things.
Yeah.
Right. So if we're focusing on the right problem, we're training, doing the initial training in context so it feels familiar, so there's less of a gap to use it in real life. If we then give a lot of feedback and coach and support, right, so that people feel supported and feel comfortable to take this to the real world, right, and know that they're gonna, get what they need to improve. And then if we measure that it actually makes a difference, that's how we win. And this has always been the enablement kind of blueprint, but it's very rarely kind of followed through on. I think tech is a big part of it, right? Like you can't review every call that exists. You can't, a manager with, from all of this, do more with less. A manager might have 10 reps now. How are they going to do 2 full discovery call role plays with them every week? That's the whole week. It's gone, right? So I think the tech needs to help. And I'm obviously biased on this point, but I don't think it's the brands people would naturally think of.
Yeah. So I think there's always, that debate around first line managers. They're always in crossfires. What should they be doing? Should they be leading deals? Should they be having a coaching framework? Should they be no. And I think the role of a first line manager is never really quite clear. Like, are they a super rep and then they're here to unlock the deals? Or are they not a rep at all and they're here to coach? Have you taught them how to coach? Do they even know how to teach someone to do something? Do you think enablement should be a pull or push motion from their point of view? Should they be told what to enable on, or should they be telling the business what the gaps are and therefore create content to enable, or like whatever framework to plug those gaps?
So I think that, firstly, I think that being a line manager in any quota carrying function is the hardest job in go-to-market by 1,000x, right? Like, because it's so undefined, because it's pure pressure, because you're always walking that line, as you said, between jumping in, right, and standing back, and also, like, typically it's your first management gig, right, which just makes it your first management gig plus a lack of definition is like a recipe for absolute disaster. I think when it comes to training, the most bizarre thing that exists, and it's a function of how many people exist in an organization, is that the people coaching something to life have also just learned it at the same time that the person that they're coaching has, right? And like that's a material issue. Because why is your opinion any different to the reps, right? Of what they've learned and how they've interpreted something. And that's certainly an area that, tech and stuff can help. I think to your question about the role and the like in prioritization, I think this is where we go, like one of the big points of failure is we choose what we enable on based on what people tell us, right? Whether that's feedback up, right, from reps sharing information, whether that's down from senior leaders who are spotting trends in the market, right? Or whether that's kind of laterally, right, enablement leaders meeting with line managers and directors and stuff. All of it is sentiment and opinion. And when you take enablement as a whole bucket out of go-to-market, everything else is data, everything else is quant, right? Everything else is ops. So given that getting better at what we say and how we say it is kind of the job, right? Like, it's really weird that it's not grounded in any form of facts. And it's a big part of the reason that the measurability of these things is so fluffy, right? Like a common thing that happens with enablement is they'll run a program to improve win rate, which is so lagging that you can't look at it for 3 to 6 months. And then when you do look at it in 3 months' time, if it's gone up, you go, that was me. Thank you very much. Promotion, please. Right. And if it's gone down, you go, market was rough last month, wasn't it? Like you just have complete deniability. It's great, but it's not very productive. And I think that like I said before, I think that what you focus on should be grounded in what is the point of failure in my business right now, or what trends are we seeing that make us think XYZ will be a problem in 3, 6, 9 months. And that should come from ops. I really think that RevOps should be defining what gets enabled, not product marketing, certainly not the CRO, right? Who in the survey, by the way, the CRO said they use data 60% of the time to make their decisions. And then we asked them what data they use. And then we took all of those free text questions and classified them back up. And actually 73% of the data that they use is their own personal opinion. So
you can't make that up. That's amazing.
but like when you put that in context, here's what happens. And like, this is great for like podcast chat, but it's and I laugh and stuff when I present it, but like it's also properly horrifying, right? Is the enablement team commonly report into a CRO, right? So the CRO dictates from their own personal opinion what needs to be focused on, right? They then don't create a culture. I know I dissed that earlier, right? But they don't create enough accountability for the managers to actually follow through and coach something, right? So they themselves are putting enablement often in this island, right? And then what happens is when the business doesn't perform and they have to do layoffs, the CRO is the one that makes the decisions as to who they lay off. And they go, well, I'm cutting you because I can't prove the impact that you're having. But the reason that you can't prove the impact that you're having is because we're doing the stuff that you made up that we have to focus on, not what we think the actual gap is, right? Which is why it's not measurable. So actually, like, this dynamic is like the person calling the shots is also the person causing a lot of the problems, right? And again, not necessarily the individual human being's fault. It's a design flaw in how the system works. And yeah, like, I think exactly what you cannot make it up. It's that's like just bonkers.
That's crazy. So, actually, you touched on the segue nicely into my question, which was around, in the last 6 to 12 months, I've seen multiple enablement functions disappear from businesses for that very reason. And the question that I've had for many an enablement person I know is, well, how do you actually measure the ROI of your role, right? Like, it's quite easy to do for someone who's an IC, as an example, within a business. Very, very straightforward, right? How much revenue did you bring in? How much do you cost over what period of time? Bam, simple. Same CSM. All of these kind of roles are very easy to be able to calculate this type of thing. With enablement, however, it's very tricky, in my opinion. It just could be because I'm not in enablement. But how do you measure the success of enablement? Because I agree with you. I do think that there's a space for enablement when it's done properly, and then the objectives of what you're trying to achieve and the focus areas have been determined in a calculated way based on data. I think enablement can be great. But how do you actually then measure the success of this as a unit?
Yeah, it's one of those, right? That's like a hugely controversial question, but shouldn't be, right? Like, nobody disagrees on how you measure a sales rep. Like,
exactly.
So yeah, I think that every organization wants to achieve the same thing, which is that they want to increase their yield. They want each employee that they have to make them more money than they were making them before, right? In go-to-market, there's only really 2 ways to do that. You can give them better leads, right? Through better marketing, better data, better whatever, right? So you can improve what goes into the system, or you can improve what happens when they're there, right? Which is making the reps better at doing their job, right? So enablement has to exist because it's pretty much the only way you can actually achieve your business objective, right? Of improving yield, which right now profitability is like super important still for everybody. I think that the typical way that it's measured, by the way, and this is in the report, and there's some irony to the fact that I'm sharing a survey to share this point. But the typical way that enablement is measured is you do a training session, which remember isn't the objective, it's the catalyst at the start of a process, right? And then after somebody sat on a webinar, you send them a survey and you say, how did you feel about qualification before this training? And then you go, how do you feel about it with Medic? Right?
Yeah.
And it's like a sliding scale. And not only is that a ridiculous thing, but it's coming from probably your friend, right? And
Yeah.
probably, and also like not many people pay attention when they're on a webinar. So you're not going to admit that, right, in a survey that's going to everyone else. So everybody smashes it up to the right-hand side, right? We asked the question, enablers said they get 98% satisfaction when
Yeah,
they
I read
send
that.
surveys, right? So it's like the most biased thing in the world.
Yeah.
And it's literally the primary way that enablement functions effectiveness is measured. The second is lagging KPIs, right? Which we spoke about before, the lack of accountability, the win rate goes up or down, right? And the third was actually looking at, I've got it here, if I can find it.
I'd imagine there's a CRO or VP of sales out there also taking credit for the lacking indicators as well. The lagging
Yeah,
indicators even.
yeah, for sure, right? Like it's or some someone in a different part of the business, right? As we launched this new feature that had better product
Yeah.
market fit, right? Like there's so many factors. I think the third was something no, that was it. It was ridiculous. It was participation, right? Because nothing says you can run a 4-minute mile like showing up. and
That's
and
crazy.
so like two of those three things are subjective and meaningless, and the third has so many other factors that you can't measure it. So this is a large part of the reason that the unfortunate situation within the market is happening, is it's just not measured well. What should happen is that every project is broken into leading and lagging, right? So the ultimate point might be a lagging KPI like win rate, but you need some kind of leading indicator that you can look at immediately, right? Like if we take outbound, everyone's favorite topic, it's not dead. If we take outbound as an example, if your objective is to improve your meeting to pipeline conversion rate, right, by getting better leads into the funnel, it's not about having more meetings, right? And a good leading indicator might be on cold calls. What's the duration of the call? How many questions is the prospect asking back, right? Like these are things that you can measure from day one of making a change, and you can trend over time, right? There's no gap. So if something materially drops in a trend, that's an external circumstance, right? But if it doesn't, that's attributed back to the training. So having these like really specific things that are in your world, right, that aren't how often are we using Gong, right? Or aren't like, did somebody fill in a spreadsheet? Like they're factual data points that you're measuring across 100% of customer interactions. So there's no bias, there's no sampling that you can measure from day one. And that I think is it's not impossible, right? But it comes back to what we said right at the start, right? Is everyone has to agree to do it. And a key part of that is enablement saying, we're not going to run any programs unless these KPIs are defined and we have a measurement mechanism in place. And that in itself starts to take care of the CRO that's obsessed with some trendy thing that they saw on LinkedIn, right? Like, well, okay, cool, but we can't do that unless we can measure it, unless it backs into a core business objective and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah. You know, it's funny you say this because it's exactly what I've come across, that all of these issues, mandatory training and success metrics being reporting on how many people took on the mandatory training. Well, it was a success because 100% of them took it. Well, yeah, because if they don't, they get sacked. Like, and there's no link between how much they pay attention to the training and how then this was applied on the field. And when I started working in that company, I did two things to start with. I reviewed a bunch of calls and I tried to look which was a vicious circle, by the way. I tried to look where the problems were by analyzing the funnel. And the funnel is funnel shape because it's so oversimplifying what the actual process looks like. So guess what? We were running bad discovery calls because the drop-off between disco and demo was high. And we were running bad demo calls because the drop-off between demo and pricing or whatever was bad. And if we were to do the training based on that stat, then everybody would have the same generic training about this is how you speak to this slide, this is how you speak to marketing, this is how you speak to sales. And actually the thing I noticed when I did this review was I went into the CI tool. That's probably the only use I had from CI tool to the service point, and I search in each transcript the word why. Do you ask why questions? Right? Just simple. Why is that happening? Why do you see this? And there was never any why questions ever. So because of that, and it was way more tactical than a fixed discovery or fixed demo or fixed business case proposals. But I think then that enabled us to go with, okay, well, we're gonna move the needle from you have to ask 3 why questions on every discovery calls. And then you'll see where that takes you, and that tripled the conversion rate.
Yeah, and super easy to measure. Yeah.
Why is this not simple? And it was hard to put it in place because I was under the fire. Like I needed to do those role plays that were mandatory and all of that. So having my own training schedule was really hard to put in place. There was literally discretionary time I needed to ask the team, and then they played the game. But in another team, I'm pretty sure the reps would have been like, no, like, I don't have the time to do that.
I think that, so firstly, like that's fantastic, right? Like it's simplified down to a point that everyone can understand exactly what they have to do. And that's backed into something that's measurable, that's coachable, right? Like a manager reviewing a call that doesn't do that is going to say what is going to say why is going to say you could have asked XYZ, right? And then it's instantly constructive, right? And then people are instantly learning. Like that's the perfect example of like something practical that would actually stick. I think that if we think back to the fact that the senior leaders are the ones that are driving what happens, one thing that we also highlight is as you go up the chain, there's a blindness that starts to come in about the adoption of the things that you think that you do, right? So, there's this question that says it's based on that Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. It says, do you agree that 90% of your training is never used in front of clients? And everyone does agree, but the trend is interesting. 73% of reps agree, 61% of line managers, and only 55% of leaders. So what that's showing is as you go up the hierarchy, leaders think that the thing that enablement is doing is working, which again is mortifying when you back it into all the other statistics that we've been talking about. But that aside, it means that when you are doing that pipeline exercise that you mentioned, right, you are making an assumption that everything that's marked as qualified is qualified, right, based on whatever framework that we're using, right? When you're considering drop-offs at discovery, you're making an assumption that everyone's following the sales methodology that you've given, right? And because you're the one deciding what people do, you're basing that, right, and you're not basing it off of like proper data or like tactical experience, you're going to often point the team in the wrong direction, right? Whereas if you go into it from this base point of we're supposed to do med pick, we're supposed to do value selling, we're supposed to do whatever else, right? That means that we within our business can define what good looks like, and we go and audit every conversation that anyone's ever had. Are people doing that? Right? And then you start to look through two lenses, right? You've got the quant lens of what's happening in the funnel and the commercial progress, and then you've got the compliance lens of are people doing what they're meant to? Because if they're doing what they're meant to and it's not working, you've given them the wrong framework, right?
Yeah.
But if it is working and they're not doing what they meant to, you're potentially missing out on an enormous additional opportunity. Like it starts to make everything immediately quite practical, just like your why question example was like you're instantly kind of jumping in, right? And I think that that's a big part of it, is just this lack of visibility into like what's actually going on. And that's what makes me sad about tools like conversational intelligence is like that should be what they're doing, right? And giving you that kind of insight. Incidentally, if you want to solve that with tech, hi. But yeah.
So what does Replicate Labs do? We haven't
we naturally stumbled across that question. We have, was that a joke, or do you actually want me to answer it?
No, I think you haven't spoken about yourself. Yeah.
Well, because for us, we exist to solve the problem of sales training not working. That's why our business was created. It's also why we do something quite different today to a year ago when we started, right? It's because our own thought process is evolving. But effectively, we think that the biggest problem in sales, not just sales training, is that we don't understand who we're talking to, right? We don't know who they are, what they do, what they care about, why they care about it, the cost of that unmet need, all that kind of stuff, right? And the way that we teach people to do that, right, and personas, is here's a slide that we show you in onboarding that someone in marketing made up that was outdated the second it was made, that you didn't pay attention to anyway, right? And then what that leads to is when we're training you on things, it doesn't sound like my customer. So when I'm then speaking to my customer and they don't sound like the training, there's this enormous mental hurdle to come over to actually use the thing that I was supposed to use, right? It feels so alien and so different to the current status quo. So what Replicate Labs does is it takes an enormous amount of information and builds an AI representation of your buyer, right? Or your buyers. And it can do things like every post, comment on LinkedIn across a bunch of people, every word of every podcast that's relevant, right, to your persona. It can listen to real calls and real emails, a whole bunch of different stuff, and build this really high context model that says, this is who my buyer is, this is what they care about, this is why they care about it. And it has functional knowledge as well, right? Competitive space, all that kind of stuff. And we update it every single day because human beings change their mind, right? And if we can put that in the middle of the training problem, it actually solves a lot of the issues, right? Because step one, I'm focusing on my buyer, not my solution. Step two, when I'm role-playing and practicing, I'm role-playing and practicing in a way that sounds exactly like the conversations I'm having in real life, just solving that context gap. Step three, when I'm getting feedback and constructive advice, it's going to align to my sales methodologies and frameworks, but it's going to be from the perspective of my buyer, which is ultimately why we're all here, right? And the last thing is, because you're using AI, you can measure everything, right? We can tell you if people practice, we can tell you if they use that skill in the real world, and then we can tell you if it impacts your input and output KPIs, your leading and lagging indicators that we spoke about before, right? So that's kind of the process. Understand your buyer, practice with them, right, in a high context situation, learn from them, and then measure if it's actually making a difference.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Well, James, I feel like time has absolutely flown by. I can't believe how long we've been on here already. It's been amazing to have you on. We do have a wrap-up question, which we traditionally ask, which is, for your whole career to date, what is your favorite memory and why?
You should really, give these as prep questions beforehand. Favorite memory in my whole career. The company that I came from, SimilarWeb, went public, and I joined it as a small startup. Probably a stretch. There were 100 people, so they were big enough that there was some safety, but they were still ultimately quite small. And they, when they went public, they were about 1,200 people, right? So going through that journey was great. And I think, the day that they went public, there was this really amazing sense of like, the word I knocked earlier, culture, right? Like just like joint ownership of everyone that had gone on that journey. Like that was something that was really special and amazing to go through. Yeah, that's what I'm going with.
Amazing. Well, James, thank you so much for joining us. It's been an absolute privilege to have you on, and it's been a really insightful conversation, which I'm sure our listeners will take a lot from. This has been the Revenue Revolution podcast. Until next time, thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
See you later. Bye.
Bye-bye.